Hello, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Woo, okay. So my name is Tina Chan. I'm a user researcher at Ubisoft Montreal, full-time on Rainbow Six Siege. I'm super honored to be the first speaker of today. This is my first time at the Games UX Summit. So today I'm going to be talking about how we use Games UX research methods in the development of marginalized characters. So the quote, "She looks like me," was directed at OSA R6's first trans operator by a player who is trans herself. So when players see themselves in characters, it really is a sign that the character is both realistic, but also celebratory, a trait that we refer to as authenticity. So in this talk, I'll be covering some approaches, struggles, and learnings from a series of authenticity workshops for these three R6 operators. So we have Aruni, who is a veteran who uses prosthetics. We have Thunderbird, who is a pilot from the Nakota Peoples, which is an Aboriginal community around the area of Saskatchewan, Canada. And then also Osa, who is an engineer who is also a trans woman. So the consultants that we brought into these authenticity workshops were community leaders or persons with lived experiences. And the workshops were a combination of expert analyses and group interviews within iterative testing. So spoilers ahead. The takeaway message of this talk is that user research can improve authenticity in marginalized characters. Okay, to set the stage, Siege is an 8 years young, tactical, realistic, multiplayer FPS under the Tom Clancy franchise. And when it first started, most of its characters conveyed the aesthetic of the American military. So we had most characters being military personnel, either from North America or Europe. So as of late, a new pillar was introduced, which was diversity. So with this pillar, it means that we were expanding our scope of realism beyond American military to capture different nationalities, different ages, different genders, and also more non-military personnel. So when considering this pillar of diversity, it's really important for this pillar to be designed at conception. So I love this example. So we all know who this is, right? Sledge, one of the more early R6 operators, he was never written as a queer character. So if we were to honor this pillar by just announcing him that he's a queer character, it's really not an authentic representation of a queer soldier from Scotland. Osa, on the other hand, was decidedly trans from conception. So she has a collection of nuances in her bio, in her art, that really speaks to her experiences as a queer person in Croatia. So thus, she has a much stronger authenticity than Sledge as a queer person. So one thing I want you take away from this slide is that when it's intended, authenticity is way stronger. And it's better if it's considered in that pipeline early on. So for authentic representation, it really helps to involve stakeholders from the community that you're trying to represent. And I'm going to talk about how we did that. So the first operator that had an authenticity workshop was Aruni. So she was a veteran, and she was also a woman who used prosthetics in the field. She was a active field agent. So in these workshops, we consulted with two people using prosthetics. One was a veteran themselves, and then we asked them to draw on their personal lived experiences to assess a fantasy design. So consultants in these virtual online workshops were shown visual aids to analyze, to kind of just audit and critique and flag things that they didn't see as making sense for a person using prosthetics. And then after we applied these designs, we revisited these consultants and asked them to validate whether or not the design changes made sense. Later on, we also used emails to validate additional elements prior to her release that also reflected her use of prosthetics. So around Aruni, the functionality of her prosthetics was the main focus. So one consultant even had a prosthetic limb and held it up to the camera and showed us all the engineering and how it worked. So as a result of these conversations, these initial stylized exposed hinges was reworked because they pointed out that it could snag fabric. A ball joint replaced the pin joint so that she would have more mobility out in the field as an agent. And then also the prosthetics weight was taken into consideration when we were designing gadgetry that may or may not make sense to fit into her arm. One thing that we learned from these conversations is that due to the really intimate topic of living with prosthetics, we used one-on-one calls to supplement these workshops if some consultants didn't feel comfortable enough to share all that they wanted to share with us. It was really emphasized from all consultants that Aruni should be shown comfortable in her own skin, and including details of her accident about how she lost her limbs would just add noise to her character. So throughout her entire journey, there was no mention of how she lost her limbs. Interestingly enough, despite the initial research scope being just her art and story, designers also found an opportunity to leverage her use of prosthetics into the gameplay. So in Siege, the default melee attack is a knife. But for Aruni, they actually wanted her to use her high-tech prosthetics to punch. So designers wanted to replace the feedback icon, which would have been a knife, with a mechanical punch. So we asked the consultants over email, does this make sense? Is it celebratory? Everyone really liked it, thought it was super cool, super powerful. So then we actually deviated from like this R6 template as an exception for Aruni. So overall with Aruni, we really valued iterative follow-ups and extending authenticity into the R6 gameplay beyond just art and bio. So Thunderbird was the second operator that we consulted in these workshops. So we used community leaders within the Nakota community on how to create an operator of Aboriginal origin. Seeing all the value that Aruni's workshops gave to Aruni, production came to us and requested authenticity feedback for her marketing really, really early on. So notably, for Thunderbird, because we didn't have a lot of knowledge about the Nakota people, the first workshop we did was very exploratory. So we asked these consultants, what would you like to see represented in a Nakota character? And afterwards, we also did some really hands-on collaboration to work on her specific symbols and insignia as well. So in the first exploratory workshop, the Nakota consultants really expressed how important water was to the Nakota community. So the first code name that she was given was Wagia, which is Nakota for Thunderbird, a mythical creature in Aboriginal myth related to rain. They also wanted her to be a champion for emerging Aboriginal issues, thus reference to the missing and murdered Indigenous women, so MMIW, was inscribed on her jacket, and this actually made it into her final model. Unfortunately, we couldn't take all feedback from consultants. They really wanted an opportunity to show a Nakota prayer, but given to the high-paced game of R6, it was just not something that we could do. In iteration, Thunderbird was chosen over Wagia to avoid pronunciation difficulties, but Wagia remained on her jacket as a nod to the Nakota language. At the same time, we realized that it was really important how mainstream was consuming Nakota culture to these consultants. So they preferred perception over hard accuracy. Her more modern piercings and makeup really deviated from Nakota traditional dress, but that was okay for the consultants. They felt that a young woman from their community would also dress like that. But they also really liked how she still had the chin tattoos to promote older Nakota practices. Now, the main struggle that we had when doing these workshops with Thunderbird was actually on the design of her unique icon. So this is a sacred symbol. It's not meant to be licensed or sold to be used in a commercial product like R6. So after lengthy discussion with the consultants, we agreed that R6 artists would make a very unique R6 version of the Creator Star with Nakota consultation. So this very unique R6 version of the Creator Star is on her model and also on her feedback UI. We also asked the consultants to later review scripts of the promotional trailers with Thunderbird over email to flag any issues. But in addition to flagging any risks, they also took it as an opportunity to do another nod to Nakota language. So the Creator Star was referred to in Nakota language. And this was not an issue because the voice actress that we had actually spoke Nakota. And she also suggested a slang of her own. So this is a scene where Thunderbird challenges a grizzly bear to a fight. So overall from Thunderbird, we saw value in collaboration with consultants, and how a character is presented to mainstream is a very important consideration for authenticity. So this balance between accuracy and practical perception was seen again when we were developing OSA. So she is an engineer and also a trans woman. Notably, unlike the consultants that we chose for Aruni and Thunderbird, we specifically recruited consultants who were knowledgeable about R6. So OSA is a character that is written for the trans players of the R6 community. So it was really important that we had consultants that could really comment on how OSA would be perceived. And of course, seeing all the great work that we did for Thunderbird, for marketing was like at day one saying, we want feedback on OSA's promotion. Okay, so in the first iterative workshop, there was very, very few changes made to her bio and appearance, but there was a lot of discussion about her general aesthetic. So her aesthetic is really grounded in sci-fi and or also horror. And consultants preemptively flagged some themes that they felt was inappropriate for a trans woman. So themes like body swapping, monster transformation, like common themes in horror, they felt that it was inappropriate because it would really trivialize gender transitioning and also make it seem a little bit more grotesque. So in collaboration, we decided on a more comical, mechanical, retro toy aesthetic that OSA carries on throughout her character. The greater struggle with OSA was actually balancing the visibility of her gender with mitigating potential transphobic toxicity against players playing as her. The tattoo specifically was a very divisive topic. So pride tattoos are very popular in the trans community. It's an act of body reclamation. And unfortunately, if we were to do something super obvious, like putting a trans flag or a trans symbol on her character model, it also flags OSA for team killing if she was in a transphobic lobby. The consultants did not reach consensus on this matter. Some felt that pride is really important. You're writing for the trans players. It doesn't matter. But then another consultants felt, well, the psychological safety of our players, especially our trans players, is also very important. So in the end, it was truly a designer's call. And instead of focusing on her trans identity, they actually leveraged her interest in her mechanics and her engineering in sci-fi and created this tattoo, which is mechanical designs. And on her forearm, there's also some like cyberpunk elements to it. The consultants really supported this plan because, kind of like we saw with Aruni, you want to bring out the character traits beyond her identity. So that should come first beyond her identity. Going back to workshop one, actually, consultants stressed very, very early on that if OSA was promoted as a trans character, like the first R6 trans character, before her gameplay demo, they expected players to hyperfixate on that conversation piece, thus dismissing her gameplay altogether. So if this was to happen, it would be an entire disservice to the R6 trans community. So considering this feedback, OSA's gender was not explored at all in promotional materials to really to avoid overshadowing her complex gameplay and background. There was only one mention of her transition, and that's in her in-game bio. And to perfect like the wording to make sure that it is both succinct and also irrefutable to anyone reading it that she was a trans woman, we did some validation emails back and forth with the consultants. Like Thunderbird, OSA's promotional trailer also received email review, and because of the whimsiness that her aesthetic brought, they really wanted to see more lightheartedness when introducing this character. So we actually had a joke in where her teammate Ace just calls her a nerd, which I thought was kind of cute. All right. So all operators, after these authenticity workshops, after they were released, received praise from the communities that they were meant to represent. So may it be showing someone with a bright outlook despite stigmatized ability, the nuances of an Aboriginal character, or visuals that celebrate the trans community. So these are quotes from social media praising their development. One thing I do want to highlight is in the gray box, that's one of the consultants that we worked with in the development of Thunderbird. And she was so impressed by how native a Thunderbird turned out that she wanted to buy a console of her own and start playing R6. Yeah. So in the end, after these 3 experiences, as user researchers, we can really conclude that authenticity workshops improve the realism and also representation of marginalized characters in games with a relatively low cost. So authenticity workshops have a really high return on investment, especially in the development of marginalized characters. We also learned some approaches and benefits when running these workshops that I want to share with you. So for user researchers in the room, here are some things that we learned to run a very successful authenticity workshop. So to be impactful, it's really important to be selective. So both in the consultants that you're bringing on and also in the data that they're providing. So there's subject matter experts who can really flag key issues based on historical data. There are community leaders who can really comment on like the state of their community, so like any emerging issues they can flag for you. And then there's also people with lived experiences who can really give you the micro details of their day-to-day experiences. So on deciding what kind of consultant you want to bring on, it depends on how granular you want the feedback and how much action that you can derive from that feedback. So it really depends on your pipeline. And like participants, consultants also have biases. And they may suggest traits that they would like to see represented that the character that you're writing for might not be the best person to represent. So one thing to work around this is that just have diversity within your consultants if possible, but also just keep in mind the design intention of the character. So constant communication with designers, if you can, is really, really helpful. But at the same time, consultants are not participants. It's okay to tell them where you are in the pipeline, what problems you're trying to solve, and what the design intention is. Because if you give them more information, they can also filter out noise on their end. And like you, they want to see their insights being acted upon. So giving them more information can let them be more specific and allow them to be more creative as well. And lastly, learnings between the characters are not always transferable and always should be confirmed. So for example, when we were designing Thunderbird, we put a lot of care and effort into visualizing her Nakota identity, so like choosing her symbols, like even I think the tooth on her helmet, we wanted to make sure it was coming from a bear that was in the Nakota region. Then for Aruni, we didn't feel like we needed to do that much because on her character model, it's really obvious she was someone with a bright red prosthetics, so it's okay. And then when we look at Osa, there's also some impractical parts to visualizing her identity. So these should be things that were checked between every character. Okay. And then something for production. In addition to delivering impactful researcher on the user researcher's part, it's also a chance for many atypical production teams, so like art and narrative, marketing, and even community outreach to be involved with user research. So we worked with ComDev and like community outreach when we were deciding, all right, should there be a skin that should be sold to benefit a charity related to the community that we were representing? So for Aruni, for example, we did have some proceeds that went to Able Gamers, and then for Thunderbird, there was a group, I think Inspire, that was for the Aboriginal youth community as well. And it builds user research influence on the production. So this means building relationships for future collaboration. One thing to note is that Aruni's workshops spanned 10 months. So the first one and the last one was about 10 months. But Osa's only spanned 6. And this is really because of the trust and the tools and the communication channels that we built with these atypical production teams over time. And lastly, building influence with consultants, so having a good relationship, really allowed us to call them back whenever there was like a new feature that we wanted their eyes on. One last thing is that authenticity workshops don't always require a user researcher to carry out. So a lot of the prior research, a lot of the coordination, a lot of the recruiting, you can train someone from production to do. And maybe you would want a user researcher or someone who is very comfortable with qualitative research methods day of, but it is something that does not need to really fall under a user researcher's mandate if resources are a constraint. To sum it up, I would like to reiterate my message that user research can improve authenticity, especially by involving cultural stakeholders. All right, questions? Thank you. Also, thank you to my team, Marie Roy, Lainey Dixon, Julianne Huguenin, and Sebastian Francois. Okay.
Thank you so much, Tina. So we have some questions on the Slido. I'm going to start with those who have been upvoted, so don't hesitate to do that because there's a bunch of questions. We might not have the time to go through them all. So I have a question from Joni. Great talk. Did you allow designers to interact directly with consultants, or did you own the relationship entirely?
Great question. No, hard no. So the reason is that when we're working with marginalized populations, one thing we were conscious of is that we didn't want to overpower them. So even in the researcher to consultant ratio, we made sure that the researcher number or observer number was less than the consultants. So for Aruni, we had 2 people, only 1 researcher. For Thunderbird, we have 3 consultants, and it was like 1.5, 2 across all workshops. And for OSA, it was about the same as well. But yeah, we limit designer contact with consultants.
We have a question from Jason. Beyond the hard work of, example, designers and producers regarding authenticity, how is the value supported institutionally, leadership and product? Oh, the thing is moving. Now I can't see the thing anymore. All right. Oh, any tension there? Sorry, as I'm reading it got upvoted.
Okay. I think I understand the spirit of the question. So there is a pillar that was established from the creative direction. We want diversity. So from day one, it was very supported that we do these workshops and also do the best that we can to represent these communities. So in these 3 case studies, no, there's no tension.
We have an anonymous question. How did you handle internal discussions and pushback from people who may have unintentionally incorporated cultural appropriation into the character design?
Sorry, I don't really understand. Could you say it again?
Yeah. So how did you handle internal discussions and pushback from people who may have unintentionally incorporated cultural appropriation into the character design?
Okay, so throughout a character design, designers do have some expertise on how to write a convincing character. They can do their own historical research on these characters. But of course, biases and just unintentional appropriation could take place. And I think that's why we do these authenticity workshops, just to bring in people from the community and then compare it to the design intention and see what overlaps. So I want to say the authenticity workshops in general was to answer to potential just, I guess, inconsistencies with the representation.
Great. There's another anonymous question. What was the compensation like for the consultants?
Okay.
Hang on. Were these marginalized communities given share of the profits that came from their involvement?
Okay, so I don't have visibility on profit sharing at all, but we did pay our consultants, and how we did it was that we asked them to propose a rate, and then we just gave them the highest rate that they voiced out. In the case where some the rate we felt was too low, we even bumped it up. I think the collaboration with the charities was our way of giving back to these communities, but in terms of profit sharing, I don't have visibility.
Sweet. I'm going to keep reading some of them, but if you're not comfortable typing your question, you can also raise your hand and we're going to bring a mic over to you. Okay, so where was I? Okay, we didn't have this one. Okay. Anonymous question, when working with culture stakeholders, how do you strike a balance between inspiration from cultural cues versus making their persona too heavily about that?
That has to be decided before you enter these authenticity workshops. So using Thunderbird as an example, we really wanted to be a little bit more collaborative with the consultants. So we were building a character that would represent their community a little bit more than, let's say, OSA or Aruni. Sorry, I missed the last part of the question.
Hang on, because it's moving all the time. How do you strike a balance between inspiration for cultural cues versus making the persona too heavily about that?
Yeah, okay. So the design intention is always prioritized. If there is something in the core design that really goes against what the community wants, then we'll flag it and they will rework it. But the design intention is always prioritized, and the consultants, they're consultants.
Okay. Question from Adam. Thanks for the great talk, Tina. Wondering if your consultants were R6 players and what the decision-making process was for whether they should or not be.
Okay, so OSA is a really good example. We specifically recruited players from the R6 community to comment about how the trans R6 community would view her. So all of OSA's consultants were trans R6 players, and they were either professionals in esports or ex-developers. For Aruni and Thunderbird, less priority was put on their R6 knowledge because it's a little bit more difficult to find persons using prosthetics and people from the Nakota Nation who are also R6 players. So we just had to use our expert judgment and navigate around that.
We're going to have one last question before we go with the next talk. And please raise your hand if you want to ask your question verbally. How did you decide which marginalized group to represent? Do you have plans to include others in the future?
Diversity, yes. So there will be more different characters written. I do not have visibility on how they decide which one. So I know that designers put a lot of care and effort to design like what identity they want to represent, but as a user researcher, I don't have visibility, unfortunately.
Any questions verbally? Just making sure that everybody can. Okay, I'm gonna go for one more because you're answering very fast. You're super efficient. Hang on, where was I in the thing? How did you apply user research methods in this kind of workshop to create such complex and representative characters?
Okay, so one is expert analyses. So we asked them, okay, this is what we want to do. Do you see any flags? So they're using their lived experiences, kind of like an expert review, if we know, in like evaluating this design. And it was always like iterative testing. So it was always like testing, which was our consultation, feedback, feedback applied, and then do it again. So it's iterative testing with like group interviews and expert analyses inside it.
There's a question that's been voted a lot lately, so I'm sorry, I'm gonna keep asking questions. From an anonymous person, how do you typically reach out and source consultants from a given community? What channels of communication do you find most helpful?
Okay, I'll tell you how we did it at Ubisoft. So as we have the privilege of being a large company with a lot of employees and their personal networks. So for Aruni, I think it was our community development team who found them. Same with OSA. Actually, no, OSA, it was actually one of our user researchers knew one of the consultants, and then they referred like other like trans leaders in the R6 space. But with Thunderbird, it was actually cold calling community centers and like asking them to refer people who were interested in commenting on a video game product.
All right, one last, I promise this is the last one. How do you get buy-in from stakeholders? It's an important one. That's why I wanted to ask it.
That's a really important question, and I'm guessing that everyone has experienced some friction along there. But again, we were super privileged that it was actually a request from stakeholders to find, just like, to make sure that they were representing the groups that they want to represent. But as you can see along like the 3 case studies, the value that we're producing like along each character was recognized by production, and then they was more eager to reach out and like give us the materials that we needed to test with each character. So again, like with Aruni, it was just like 2 touch points and some emails, and it spanned 10 months. But by OSA, I think it was like 4 touch points, and it was only like 6 months. So yeah. This previous work.
All right. Can we give a round of applause to Tina? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. If anyone has specific questions about methods, just find me around.
Thank you, Tina. And